The last couple of Bobby Fischer games that I looked at were beautiful attacks. But actually, it's probably more typical of his games that he produced long positional grinds, and he really wore his opponents down. And when I recently heard this quote of Boris Spassky, he said, "When you play Bobby, it's not a question of whether you win or lose. It's a question of whether you survive." And looking at his games and that kind of incredible will to win that he displayed, he never gave up trying to win. That quote is absolutely right. And it put me in mind of Magnus Carlsen and his style as well. The way he gets a slight advantage and then just keeps going, keeps turning and keeps going until, well, as we've seen so often, his opponent cracks. And the game that I'd like to look at, which I think really typifies this approach of Fischer's, was played in the last round of the US Championship 1963-64, and it's against Anthony Sadie. At this stage, this was a 12-player all-play-all. And at this stage, Fischer had 10 out of 10. Of course, he'd won the tournament a few rounds previously. And this was the game that Fischer won to score 11 out of 11. I mean, this is unprecedented and never been seen since. This was not a weak US Championship. The rest of the field were, I'm reading it from this book, Games of Robert Fischer. So Larry Evans, Paul Benko, Sadie, Reshevsky, Robert Byrne, Donald Byrne, Weinstein, Bisguy, Addison, Mednis. I mean, this was a really serious tournament. And to get 11 out of 11, well, that's for that reason. This game has always been a favourite of mine, and I just love the style. And I was very interested to hear during the World Championship match in New York in November, both Karyakin and Carlsen were asked for their favourite Fischer game. And Carlsen, well, the game that sprung to mind, first of all, from Carlsen was actually this game. It's not the most spectacular game, but as I said, it is very much in Carlsen's style. So let's take a look. Well, we join the game after 23 moves. Not a very exciting prelude, and they've reached this position where it's symmetrical pawns, but white has this bishop against this knight. Now, Fischer recognised that this position would actually give him some winning chances. The problem is this bishop hasn't got anything to attack. There are no weak pawns on black squares for the bishop to attack, and the bishop is slightly restricted by that pawn on d4. It would be much healthier if this were a light squared bishop where it complements the pawn on dark squares. And Fischer recognised that this gave him some advantage. So what's the strategy here? Well, you have to work in phases. So the first phase is to tie white down to the defence of that pawn. So here we go. He manoeuvred his knight round to this square. It happens very easily. White can't actually do much. I'll come back at the end and show you where I think white could have improved. I mean, I think objectively this position is drawn. This is a common kind of position, very stereotypical actually. And I'll return to this at the end of the game. So first phase is complete. One of white's pieces, the king or the bishop, is going to have to look after that pawn. But at the same time, that knight, as well as attacking the pawn, actually controls some nice squares on the king side as well. So what's the second phase? Well, time to gain some space on the king side. So that's what Fischer does by advancing his pawns. Now he's starting the press on the king side. and that also allows the king to join the struggle. Well, before he does anything, he gets his king into play. I have a funny feeling there might have been a bit of time pressure involved because, well, not from Fischer's side, but from White's side here. Really, White can only wait. He can't try and break through on the queen side. There's simply no room there. You can play a5, but the position is still closed. The knight covers that square, and then then Black starts to make progress on the other side of the board. So White has to wait. And here we go. Fischer advances. Now, over the next few moves, Fischer actually doesn't make too much progress, but, well, there's no harm in just hanging loose for a moment, just letting White stew in his own juice. You know, he might make a blunder. And again, we've seen this time and time again in the games of Carlsen. He just kind of shuffles around, seeing if there's any tactic, any little opening that he can go for. But Fischer was probably analysing these king and pawn end games as well. In fact, this doesn't get anywhere, but it's always worth looking at these kind of positions. In fact, the king can come back, and there's no harm. I mean, maybe let's play that one first. Make sure we have a couple of tempo moves, and basically after this, the black king isn't breaking through. But that's the kind of endgame that White must always be wary of. Black always has the option to simplify. But Fischer waits. This is good strategy. And finally, he starts to make a little bit more progress. He decides to push this f-pawn to gain more space. So he's probably gone as well. He's gone as far as he can, but that, with the kingside pawns, what he really needs to do is try and break through. Not so simple while that pawn is on f3. If he could get rid of that pawn, then the king would have a chance to come into e4. But let's see, what's the next phase? Okay, first of all, he improves the position of this knight. So the knight is still hitting the d pawn, very useful, but it's looking at these squares as well. So potential jumping in points to the position. And now finally the time has come where black has to make a breakthrough. So g4. And now it's getting serious for White, because the threat is to play g3, bishop retreats, and then knight h4 hits the pawn on g2. So White has to trade. The knight comes back. Now you can see, having knocked out that pawn on f3, it's getting more critical because the e4 square is potentially available for the king. Here White played bishop e1, and he's probably already lost, but actually he can still save the position here. Let me show you how. He should play king e2. And then king f3. And the point is that White is going to play this move. So, for example, here. And now we play a5. That's important. That means that black has no tempo moves. And after this, g4 will do the job. And this is just a draw. Basically, well, black is not going to get anywhere in this position. Yeah, if this is taken, then you can see that the king blocks out black's king, and black doesn't have any tempo moves to force the white king away. So that would actually be a draw. But, you know, again, this reminds me of these sort of long Carlsen games. There's always a moment where you can identify, yes, Carlsen's opponent should have played there and he would have made a draw. But 9 times out of 10, they crack because you're under pressure for so long and you can't defend with 100% accuracy. It's just impossible. In the game, White missed his chance with King E2 and instead played Bishop E1. Knight takes G4. So there are 2 targets, the D pawn, which you can try and hit through here, and also the G pawn. And White finds it impossible to hold this position. The king coming in. Knight G3 check. Now in this case, of course, if that's taken, it's all about space. After this, Black's king is in and you take the pawn. And what about King F2? The knight bounces around and comes into E3, followed by a check here. And again, there's simply no defense. Let's go back. So King D3. Knight comes around. So now there's a threat to play here. Bishop covers. Knight here. And threatening this pawn. And of course, once again, this king and pawn endgame would be completely lost. F3 again, and the king comes in. So Sadie gave up the G pawn, but now of course it's absolutely hopeless. And here the bishop is going to be forced away from the diagonal and the pawn will go through to make a queen. Just wonderful. Those of you that have good memories might recall a similar endgame in the Karpov-Kasparov match from 1984, where Karpov made a beautiful breakthrough on the king side. Perhaps we'll look at that another time. But this kind of endgame with a bad bishop against the knight is very familiar and rather typical. But what a performance. Let me show you another position. Let me come back just a moment. Let me just find this if I can, hopefully. Yeah, have a look at this position. Well, I may as well go from the beginning. This was one of my games. I played in the Swiss Team Championship a few years ago. I've got black, my opponent played C3, and with this we transpose into a kind of French Tarrasch. I've always felt very comfortable playing with an isolated queen pawn. I like the space it gives you, I like the activity that you get with your pieces. So yeah, I've always been very comfortable with this particular variation. So White played Bishop D3, perhaps looking to, who knows, looking at H7. The sack isn't on at the moment, but anyway, H6 is a useful move to take away any possibilities of a bishop or a knight coming to G5. Now my opponent played Knight D4. Now, here's my question for you, which I'll answer in the following week. What would you play here with black? What did I play in this position? There is a connection to what we've just been looking at, by the way. Okay, thanks for watching. See you soon.